Welcome everyone to SportTechie Live. This is on our human performance track. Seeing the future of sports requires great vision. And this is a little bit of history in the making for those of you who tune in regularly to these sessions. This is our first tri-continental panel. We've got Sean all the way in tomorrow over in Australia. We've got Kathy and Dr. Labby in the UK, and then I'm in New York. Lucas is in Chicago, and so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are thrilled to have this panel. As someone who has had very poor eyesight, but also poor visual performance skills throughout my life, I think this will be educational for me, as hopefully it will be for all of you. I will take a brief moment to introduce our speakers. Dr. Labby is an ophthalmologist and the sports vision specialist at Sports Vision NYC. He's the president of iCheck Systems, and he has worked as a sports vision consultant in professional sports for a couple of decades, most notably, or at least to me, in Major League Baseball, where he has several World Series rings. He's also worked with the NBA, NHL, and is currently in the UK on assignment with for a Premier League client. And he's also worked for the Olympic team. We have Kathy Craig. She is the professor of perception action psychology at Ulster University, who has published over 100 scientific papers and was the first in the world to use virtual reality technology to understand decision-making in sport. She's the co-founder and CEO of Incisive, a neurotechnology startup that combines the power of immersive technologies with data analytics to measure and improve a person's decision-making abilities. Next, we have Sean Muller. He's assistant professor at Federation University, specialized in the field of expertise in skill learning in sport and how athletes and experts use visual information to anticipate action. He has collaborated with several sports organizations such as Cricket Australia, Hockey Australia, and the Tampa Bay Rays of Major League Baseball. And then we have Lucas McKnight. He was the Illinois State Player of the Year in 1998 in baseball before going on to play collegiately, getting drafted by the Chicago Cubs, playing 5 years in the minor league system before becoming an area scout, cross-checker, and the assistant director of amateur scouting until 2020. And he is now the director of baseball at Visual Edge. So welcome to you all. To those of you in the audience, please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself in the chat section, as I see we already have someone chiming in from Portugal. So good to hear as well. On the second tab over there is the questions tab. I will try to do my best to work those in throughout the panel. Don't hesitate, and save them for the end, as I will try to work them in as appropriate. And now I'm sure my bios skipped quite a bit of interesting information for each of our experts. So I'll let each of them follow up a little bit more, particularly answering that question: what visual skills do you seek to improve in athletes? What is your approach, and how do you go from there? Dr. Labby?
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for the introduction, and hello, everybody. Welcome. It's a pleasure to meet my co-panelists and to have an opportunity to talk about something I really enjoy, and that's the role of vision in sports, sports performance, and actually any kind of performance outside of sports. We've kind of called it sports and performance vision quite a bit, because there's performance in all aspects of life. You did a great job with the bio. I don't think there's anything to add, really significantly on there. But I think the approach is important. I think it's important to understand that we're talking about vision, but we're not just talking about the eyes. We're talking about what the eye can transmit to the vision parts of the brain, how that information is then processed, and how a decision is made to make a motor action, then how that vision can guide the motor action for success on the pitch. And I think it's the whole pieces together, those whole three different sections, that one has to consider when we're talking about sports and performance vision.
Great, thank you. Kathy?
Hi, everybody, and thanks very much for the introduction, Joe. You did a great job. So, yeah, and I would like to echo what Daniel just said there. So for me, the really important thing is to make this distinction really between vision and perception. So vision, if we want to be quite pure about it, is the act of seeing, but perception is really what does the brain do with that information. So my background is really understanding information. So what is the patterning of information we pick up through our eyes, and how does the brain then use that information to drive those all important decisions about action? So As you said, I'm a perception action psychologist, so I see the two inextricably linked. So you perceive to move, you move to perceive. You can't really dissociate the two. They have to come together. They have to stay together as well. So a lot of the research I've been driving and pioneering in the background is how can I use technology to maintain that coupling between perception and action.
Sean?
Thanks, Joe, for the introduction, and thanks for being part of this invitation to be a part of this panel. My perspective is from expertise and skill learning, and the approach I use is looking at expert less skill comparisons and also expertise differences within expert groups. The approach I take to vision is that perceptual information is in the environment. There are cues that one can use to predict what might happen, and that maps on to action to guide action. And for me, that happens in a two-stage process. So stage one, a predictive type thing where you pick up advanced cues to maybe move into position, and then you might use later information to fine-tune and adjust to maybe strike. So a two-stage process is sort of what I work on.
And Lucas, you're the cleanup hitter.
Yeah, thanks for that. If you saw me swing, you never would have mistook me for a cleanup hitter, but I appreciate it anyway. Intimidating group to follow, so much expertise and such a long history and vision. My focus is obviously in baseball, and part of our mission is just letting people know that these visual characteristics and your visual skills are malleable. They're trainable. They're not set and fixed. Whatever you score as a hitter, it's one more place to improve. I've long thought maybe we don't train our hitters correctly in baseball, that we spend so much time on the physical. And as hitters get closer to the big leagues and get closer to the apex, hitting becomes much more of a cognitive and visual exercise. And we don't take the same amount of time to train that. We take all sorts of swings in the cage, but we don't also train the eyes and train the cognition and train all the things that you talk to upper level hitters, they tell you are really important. So for me, that's a passion of ours, is getting that out there and letting people know how malleable these skills can be.
Mm-hmm. As a journalist, I think it was probably about 5 years ago that I sort of really became aware of how this field was coming along, and certainly I think it was Visual Edge that product that I had a chance to try out, and it was very humbling for me. But I've seen in the last 5 years just how much it has exploded from afar. Obviously, you guys are the ones sort of in the field and in many ways driving a lot of that research. So what have been some of the latest developments, latest research? What's hot in this industry? Maybe start with you, Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, I'm a little bit biased, so it's back to the technology that I tend to use. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about, you talked about 5 years ago. I've got, I suppose, a slide that I prepared of like VR technology, as I said to you before, like started using the technology probably 20 years ago. It's a long time ago now. And it was really to answer a simple question. And it's interesting because it's similar to baseball, and it was in soccer. And it was really trying to understand curve free kicks in soccer. What does it mean for the goalkeeper? Are they more difficult to anticipate? If so, why? Because all our actions, all our interceptive actions require us to anticipate where that ball's going. We have to get to the right place at the right time. And to do that, we need to be picking up and detecting the relevant information. So there was a very famous kick by Roberto Carlos back in '97, I think it was, just before the World Cup. And the ball bent really wide like that there. Roberto Carlos was an expert at this. Fabian Barthez, the goalkeeper, just stood there. He didn't move, and the ball went into the back of the net. And the thing that interested me was there was a ball boy over to the left-hand side. He moved to the side as if the ball was going to hit him. So I was thinking, what is it about that curve free kick? Everybody seemed to think that ball was going wide. Why? So I needed a technology that would recreate the viewpoint of the goalkeeper. Video doesn't cut it because the geometric location of a camera is different from where it is for the goalkeeper. And that's really, really important when we're trying to understand visual skills and perception in sport. You need to recreate the position and that viewpoint of that player at that moment in time. Why? Because it's the optical information that the eyes are picking up in the back of the head that's really telling you where the ball is going. So you've got various optical angles, the ball coming towards you, the looming information, the ball moving to the side. So that's for me where virtual reality technology came in. Even though 20 years ago it was extremely rudimentary, I was able to recreate the optical information you would be able to get in those scenarios. But I think the exciting thing for me, and where I see it sort of going, and why this call is so exciting, is the technology is advancing so fast. So I've got a little slide here that I'll just show you of what basically VR technology was like all those years ago, and what it is like now. Just trying to call up my slide here. There we go. So I'll just share that. Can you see the slide okay?
Yes.
So this is a little bit my sort of theory around perception action, but it's also combining the detecting information and action capabilities that drives decision making. But I'll come back to that later. But this is essentially the technology in 2011. So here you've got a goalkeeper. This is in the research lab at the university. You're tethered to a machine. You've got like trackers on the hands. You've no trackers on the feet, no trackers on the torso. You've got very rudimentary graphics also inside. So these are the graphics inside the headset. The hands are very clunky. There's no control of those. Even the graphics of the ball aren't great either. But that's a video, obviously, of what was played in there. So it was slightly better inside the headset. You have a small field of view as well. So then you fast forward to 2021, you've got wireless technology, you've got avatars, you've got AI to drive the movement of the avatars, and you've got what we call this behavioral realism. So your players in the virtual world are able to play like they are in the real world. And importantly, it's these analytics that you see on the screen here that we're able to get out with this technology that's really exciting for me. So we use that technology to understand something about the decision making, because the decision is manifested through the action that the player makes. So what they do, when they do it, and how do they do it. Those three pillars of decision making is something we can measure very precisely with that technology.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Sean?
Joe, my perspective is to sample the perceptual information to a degree that exists in the natural setting. So whether it be a choreographed filming of a pitcher throwing a fastball, a curveball, or to take that from the natural setting. Now, that's not going to be exactly from a camera that's sitting on the batter's head, because that's not possible to do. So I might use footage from what you might see in ESPN, where the camera's behind the catcher. And that provides the most realistic cues under high pressure that a batter is going to see that you can get. And from that, I use techniques to challenge the batter using occlusion, point light displays, to then get an idea of how they predict and anticipate, and then use that information to test for talent identification and then training. I'll just share my slide now, just to show you, the audience, what that looks like. So hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
This is an example of temporal occlusion used from live match footage. Okay, and the task is to predict pitch type and location. Fastball, curveball, changeup, inside or outside the strike zone. It occludes, and you need to predict, and hopefully you predicted that was a curveball, and that would be inside the strike zone. Right, what you also can do, and this is a cricket example, is spatial occlusion. Remove body parts. So this is a bowler with just the hand and the arm showing, and it's occluded, and you've got to predict whether it's going right or left. You can convert that 2D baseball footage to what's known as a point light display. So here's a point light display. These are actual actions that happen in the game situation. So you can film your opponent, create a point light display that challenges you to test and train against the kinematics important for pickup to predict the pitch type. You can also do that for fielding. Okay, so here's a batter swinging, and you occlude, and the fielder's got to predict which direction the ball's going. These are in-game footage. Now, the other instrument I use are occlusion glasses. It's a cricket batter wearing these glasses. They're clear at the moment, full padding, and when I trigger the glasses, you see them going opaque, and the batter has to swing to hit the ball. So the video footage was about more perception, where you can control things, and then we've tested it with the occlusion glasses, and we know that, in fact, when you couple action, that these batters can move into position and they can predict and strike. So having validated that, you know now that I can use the perception-only test to assess and train. I might leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Dr. Labby?
Yes. I think it's interesting. As a former Harvard professor and as an ophthalmologist scientist, my approach is one of data and science, and I want to, all these. The technology has really expanded. In 30 years that I've been doing this, next year will be the 30th anniversary. We started with a paper Snellen chart, and now we have a fairly high-tech vision testing system. In the terms of computer assessments, we've gotten lots of different products that have been very useful. What we've heard about today are things that weren't available even a couple of years ago. But we need to make sure we've approached these products kind of in a systematic way, that we've vetted them in terms of data, independent research showing that these products do what they say they do, and these products improve players and athletes as they say they do. So I look at a more a more unified picture, and if you have my pyramid, we can talk about how that overall picture I think should be approached. And this gives us a template to use to plug in, if you will, the technology that's been developed over the last several years, and hopefully we develop in the future. And obviously the goal of any pyramid is to have excellent on-field performance at the top of the pyramid, but the ability for that top of the pyramid to be tall and high and stable depends on what's underneath it. And for example, any technology is not going to be useful if the athlete who's using the technology can't basically see. If the visual ability is the very bottom of that pyramid, if that visual ability isn't sufficient, then you have what I learned in computer science as an undergraduate, you have garbage in, garbage out. You're not going to be able to make the proper decision on time. You're not going to make the motor action that has to be guided by that vision accurately if you don't see properly. And each sport, as you mentioned, Joe, I've worked with Olympic athletes in many sports, many different sports, U.S. and abroad, and each sport has different visual requirements. And so to say somebody needs to be 20/20 or 20/15 or 20/10, you need to say what sport we're talking about, because a boxer doesn't need to have the same vision that an Olympic archer, or a professional baseball player or cricketer needs to have. And that's going to be different than a footballer, whether it's an American footballer or a non-American footballer. And so the need for the athlete in their sport is critical, and making sure that the bottom of the pyramid is optimized in terms of sharpness of vision and the contrast ability. If we then move up one level, we're talking about how those two eyes then work together in the brain for what we call binocular vision or stereo vision. Certain sports, again, stereo vision, stereopsis is more important than other sports. A fencer, for example, we published a paper in reviewing our data from the U.S. Olympic team in Beijing, looking at a whole multitude of different sports, and the archers had excellent acuity but terrible stereo vision. That makes sense because the target is flat and is far away. The fencers didn't have as good vision, but they had better depth perception. Makes sense because you have to know where the opponent's foil is. And so you really can't, there's no blanket statement that every sport needs a certain treatment or a certain exercise or a certain detection ability. They need to be individualized for the sport. As you move up, if the sharpness of vision is good and the use of both eyes together is good, then you get to a point where many of the products, many of the devices we've heard about today have a very significant role, and that's in the perceptual side of things, decision making, leading to a motor action. And somebody who doesn't have concentration that's adequate is not going to be able to sit at the plate and watch a pitcher, take his time in his windup. He's going to start thinking about something else, and he's not going to miss critical cues that he needs to pick up on. That certainly, if there's occlusion going on, he'll really miss. And so that becomes something that becomes a point of evaluation and hopefully intervention. But we have a paper coming out in about a month or two, a sports vision special issue of one of the journals, where we review the methods that are used in sports vision research, and sadly to say, they're probably far below where they should be in terms of rigor and believability, which is what everybody wants. An athlete wants, a team wants to be able to believe that what we're telling them is really going to be true. So just as my overview, I think, and if you take that paradigm, maybe it's a little easier to understand where everything fits as technology develops in the past and in the future.
Yeah, wonderful. And Lucas, I shared that I had tried Visual Edge 5 years ago, but my understanding is you tried it much sooner. So I'd love to hear your early experience as a baseball player with it and how it's come along in recent years.
Yeah, sure. So I was something of a minor baseball prospect out of high school, and I had a professional scout come into my house and give me an eye test, which I actually failed miserably, which was funny because the one thing I could do was put the bat in the ball. So something didn't add up. Turns out I took the test in low light, and it was the issue with the test more so than me. But it led my dad and I to go on a chase to see if my vision was right. It connected us with Barry Seiler in Vernon Hills at the time, and with Visual Edge. And so I was a very early user of Visual Edge. Saw the immediate benefits of using it and training, and how I saw things just a little bit more slowly at the plate when I did. And ended up having a great season. Unfortunately, everything was, or I should say nothing was mobile at that point. I went to college then with a Gateway, big Gateway desktop computer, if we all remember those, that you had to put together yourself. So nothing was mobile. So I got away from the training. Wish I would have stuck with it. But played for a few years in the minor leagues. I was so good that they made me a scout. And then we started to use these visual tests as a screening process with our players, and Visual Edge was one of them. And kind of talking with what Dr. Labby said about evidence behind the test, that's what always made Visual Edge stand out as a testing alternative, as well as a product that it had been backed by, now 15, 20 years of data to show that, players that score well on our test are players that turn out to be pretty darn good hitters. So we use that with the Cubs. We use some different visual assessments with the Cubs. One thing led to another. Ultimately, Brian Kopp and I connected again and brought me back in the fold here. So it's been fun.
Lucas, I think you're breaking up quite a bit here.
Much the chase of fun.
We're having a little trouble hearing you. Maybe
right.
You want to try quickly logging back in, and we'll.
Pitching is ahead of hitting. It's been a forever cat and mouse game. All
right, we'll get back to Lucas shortly. And for the rest of you, we've talked a lot about these sports that do require these fast reaction times: baseball, cricket, goalkeeping against penalty kicks. These are some of the ones that have come up. What are some of the cues that a hitter or goalkeeper should be looking for? And then, of course, how do you work on training that? I think sort of follows what you were discussing earlier about your methods, but love any more detail that you can share about the cues that you should look for. You want to start, Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think one of the key things from the research, particularly the work that I've done recently with the Australian field hockey team, and this is goalkeeping in a very time-constrained situation where the ball flight from the penalty corner is coming, 120 kilometres an hour over maybe a 10-metre distance, is that we use the mixed methods design, and we ask them, what information sources do you think you use? And they said, we don't use anything pre-ball flight. But when you actually test them using the video occlusion methods, they predict based on the occlusion at the stick ball contact of the drag flicker above the guessing level. So the key point to make there is some of these things are very subconscious, and they're not necessarily aware of everything that they're using, and they may not be able to consciously explain that. This isn't a purely perception test that is sometimes thought to be highly conscious, when in fact those tests can show as I showed you as in the examples, that indeed subconscious processing is happening. And we know that the motor system is also involved when you're static, viewing those things, as you would do when you're trying to save. So some of the cues, even in field hockey, is that the contextual information before the opponent's movements, the runner going out to the spot, or the pitch count in baseball, followed by the kinematics of the opponent, the pitch out or the drag flicker, together are important cues to then make that first stage movement. You know, how am I going to get my weight transfer in baseball set? Or as a goalkeeper, what direction am I going? That first stage is really critical, because it's very difficult to adjust beyond that if you've made that first step incorrectly.
Mm-hmm. Dr.
Yeah.
Levin?
I'd like to follow up
Kathy,
on
go for it.
that. Yeah, so Sean's quite right. I mean, it's back to our discussion earlier about vision, and I'd really like to hammer home the point that it's not just about acuity. It's not just about the spatial, it's about spatial temporal information. It has to be about how it unfolds over time. It's about the patterning of information. And all our research is very much based on, or all our technology is based on the research. And I've got bad news for people. Faster isn't always better. It's back to the temporal framework within which you have to work. So back to what Sean described, in those instances where the temporal window within which you have to respond is so short, you have to use advanced cues. You have to rely on body kinematic information. You have to look at the dynamics of the hitter. Penalty kicks in soccer, exactly the same. You've got the ball 12 yards from you, or it could be a little bit longer. You've got less than 100, maybe 100 milliseconds to respond to that. You have to make that decision about left or right before the ball is hit or at the ball point contact. But what's really interesting, Sean, is that the recent research by colleagues of mine in Portugal have shown that even though you've made the judgment to the left or right, the horizontal component of the movement, they've analysed 200, 300 penalty kicks in competitive games, you can still adjust the vertical component. So even though the ball's in mid-flight, you can still make those more sort of like reactive movements to stop the ball. And it's the same in field hockey as well. So I think it's really interesting. And the eye movement data back this up in futsal. So when the ball is further away and there's more time for you to respond, your eye tracking is on the ball trajectory. But when the ball's close, less time it's on the player's body. And it's the same as side steps in rugby as well. When you're trying to deceive a player, it's very important where you look to pick up that relevant information.
I would, Kathy, just emphasize that it's, assuming that the vision is good and the person is able to see clearly the cues that they need to pick up, whether it's, something large like a limb movement or something small like a spin of the baseball. What they're actually looking at is critical as well. We've been using some eye tracking glasses that we use on the batters to see what the batters are actually looking at before, during, and after the ball's been released, to make sure they're actually looking at the right places at the right times, and frankly, to understand what they should be looking at, what's normal to look at. And there's been some good work out of Australia that kind of highlights that in the past. And I think that to show a batter, we show players all the time what they see in a play, they watch their own play, but they never get to see what they see. And if you use these eye tracking glasses, you're able to show them what they actually see themselves when they were facing this pitcher and actually swinging. And that can be very educational, just like watching plays in general can be. And so this is a technology, the eye tracking technology, which has really blossomed in the last 3 to 5 years, both in terms of lower costs as well as options. And there's different quality of options, but different options. And I think this field has gotten so interesting that, companies like Apple have bought whole companies of eye trackers, SMI, to incorporate into probably a future product of theirs, for the general public. And so the concept of what are you looking at while you're trying to perform, I think, is an incredibly critical component.
Actually, a question just to follow up on that. What eye tracking technology specifically are you using?
I don't have any interest financially in any company that has eye tracking technology, but we had used previously the SMI company that was purchased by Apple and is no longer available. But I've been very happy with Toby's eye tracking glasses for the last, I guess, 3 years or so. We've done some NBA foul shooting studies that we published about that. We've used them in several baseball situations, and actually currently using it in the Premier League as you described.
Mhm. And actually, sort of following up on that, what I was about to ask is, obviously there are these different platforms. I'd love to dive a little deeper in, we have virtual reality, point light, occlusion, strobe glasses. The Visual Edge product that Lucas's team uses is use 3D glasses on an iPad or a computer. What are the comparative benefits and drawbacks to each, and why why specifically have you chosen the ones that you have to work with? Maybe stick with you, Dr. Labby, for first.
Well, I have a closet room full of old equipment. Let's say, I'm interested in trying anything that I think might have an effect. At spring training, for example, the teams, we didn't this year because of the COVID situation is a little bit different, but in general, we try to bring one thing new to look at that has promise. Sometimes we find that it doesn't have any relevance and we put it in the closet. And sometimes, we find that it's useful and we have data that's helpful to teams, the teams that we work with. We looked at things like retinal pigment and taking supplements for retinal pigment. We've looked at dynamic vision testers that came out of Japan in the past. Certainly the eyeglass, several different eye tracking glasses. I've had 3. I have 4 or 5 virtual reality headsets at home, that are used for different purposes and different resolutions and so forth. And so, I think if we're going to be in this field, as far as I'm concerned, just like when I care for patients in my medical practice, I want to be at the cutting edge of what's available. And, I turn to people like my fellow panelists here that are developing these softwares and these technologies to make them available, to be able to test them and hopefully demonstrate in a third-party independent way that there's relevance. And then it becomes part of the, we'll say, standard of care in sports vision.
Mm-hmm. Kathy, you pretty strongly, gave an endorsement to virtual reality. Why is that? And would you consider any other, device instead?
Well, VR has embedded eye tracking as well. The Tobii system is embedded inside, for example, the HTC Vive. We've tried to use it, but it's actually very inaccurate when you're trying to track a ball that's at a great distance and depth, because you're trying to figure, well, what are they really looking at? So that is very difficult to analyze. So we can also use head movement, because you're going to track the ball like it's gaze that really tracks the ball. So you'll turn your head with your eyes and your head that basically allow you to follow a ball. So that gives you lots of really good information as well. Why am I a fan of virtual reality? Well, for me, it's about behavioral realism. It's opportunities to practice. So there's lots of talk about training visual skills, but for me, it's very, very difficult to dissociate those. You have to be able to do it in situ. You have to have those opportunities to practice. It's neurons that fire together will wire together. So my little, I suppose, diagram about detecting information and action capabilities that drive decision-making is really important to remember, because the detecting information is back to what we're hearing about in the vision skills, being able to tune into it, pick it up. But the action capabilities is really interesting, and people tend to dissociate that from decision making, but actually it's very much part of it. So I always give the example that in tennis, I'm really quite rubbish at playing my backhand. So what I will do, the decision I'll make is to move around and try and play a forehand. And why? Because my action capabilities to execute a backhand are pretty poor. We've seen the same thing in rugby when we give them a decision-making drill. So you give them gaps that appear on the right and the left-hand side. And in rugby, if you're right-handed, to pass to your left is to pass off your strong hand. I used to play out half, so I had to do that, and I'm right-handed. Passing off my left hand out to my right, I was less confident in. What did that mean? When there was a decision to make and it was a pass out left with a long pass out right, I wouldn't make that decision because I wasn't confident in my action capabilities. So I think we need to understand how this all might work together, that you could detect the gap, you could see it, but you don't act upon it. And I think for me, that's really interesting, how you can develop motor skill to change those decisions about action. And I know in rugby, like there's been sort of a transformation in how players can pass the ball. Like there's the pass out the back door, the Sonny Bill Williams pass that you can do it off. Now kids do this, and you see kids trying to practice and do things like other people do. And that's great because they're developing their motor repertoire. That means when that situation arises, they can make and execute that decision. So I think that's what's quite exciting about the technology, is trying those things you maybe couldn't try and practice till you get it perfect.
Mm-hmm. Great. Lucas, welcome back. We were discussing sort of some of the pros and cons of the different platforms, and I know Visual Edge, it's you use your 3D glasses. Why is that sort of your company's preferred methodology, and what else have you seen out there in the market that interests you?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially as it applies to baseball, I mean, depth perception is just kind of everything. Perceiving where things are in space, being able to recognize things early, that's kind of everything. So the 3D component is really, really important. I mean, we can recognize things on a flat screen, but being able to do so with an element of space, with an element of distance, is just a little bit of a game changer for us. I would also just, ours has really changed a lot just now that it's become mobile. That kids can take this into the clubhouse, or big league players are using it before a game as a warm-up exercise for their eyes. The fact that this stuff has become mobile has made it just a world better for people not to have to use this in a fixed setting, and being able to use it at their leisure and be able to train on their own time.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Sean?
Joe, I've as I said before, I've used occlusion 2D and point light, because again, it's highly representative of the movement pattern that a performer is going to see, right? So I can capture that in game, or I can choreograph it, and from there I can temporarily control what they see, the duration of what they see, but also with the point light present only the key kinematics, and that's been quite portable. It's well established in discriminant validity. It predicts performance, and it's been shown that you can train perception, and there's a benefit to when you go into the field and you couple perception and action. So for me, the motor system is still involved when you're looking at these displays, and even if you're not moving. And that's an important component, that it's tapping into perception, cognition, and the motor system that drives action, as you would do in a field setting.
Mm-hmm. And to just kind of dive a little deeper into that, that link between perception and motor skills. Go, Dr. Labby, you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, just one question for Kathy, because one of the things that I often have a problem with VR, and that I think other people have experienced similar things, is the resolution of the VR headsets. Then, no question, as you showed in your work, the light years from what it used to be. But when we're talking about a fast-moving sport with a small target, where spin of the target becomes important, whether it's baseball, cricket, tennis, so forth, we found the resolution of those displays to be lacking to truly represent that. Is there any workaround that you have for that? Anything you've done to sort of help in that area?
I mean, it's the smaller the object, you're right, the more difficult it is to perceive those very subtle changes. So some of the work that we've done in the past around this has really been around how the color of the ball might influence perception. We did some very interesting work with Adidas Innovation Team Football back in 2011. This was after the disastrous Jabulani ball from 2010. I don't know if you remember when the World Cup was in South Africa. There was the Jabulani ball was basically a triangle that was printed on a sphere. So the engineers, I'd done some work with them in Marseille and France when early 2000s. My very first VR work was with Adidas. So they basically wanted to understand, is it the design on the ball that's causing a problem? Or is it the new manufacturing technique that means there's fewer panels that's affecting the ball flight that's causing this perceptual problem? Because there was so many critics of it, goalkeepers, outfield players, everybody was saying, you can't predict where this ball is going to go. And Daniel, this is back to my key point. It's about prediction and anticipation, and it's looming information. And you don't need 3D to see looming. You've got insects that are very good at flying around the world without 3D vision. So again, it's the patterning of information for the brain. We're so sensitive to the looming. Yes, the detail of spin. Yes, that I agree. There is that need to have that there. But the interesting thing was back in 2011, we were still able to use our technology to unpick this difference between the design on the ball. So we compared the Jabulani with the classic Buckminster, which is your black and white. And we then compared their different levels of flutter that they were creating with the ball. So basically the technology, what we did then, Daniel, was essentially the ball's coming towards you. We measure the movement response of the player. So if the ball is coming and it's moving and you're as a player going, oh, left, right, then the movement of the player is telling you where they think that ball's going to go. So again, it's a technology and a methodology for us to really understand what's going on in here. Because for you to anticipate or to intercept something, you have to put your body in the right place at the right time. So back to your detail, are they able to see maybe numbers on those balls? Probably not. But we're doing some current work around concussion, and there we're actually using numbers on balls. And the new Oculus Quest, honestly, the technology is fabulous. The Oculus Quest 2, the resolution there is really something quite spectacular. And I always draw the analogy to people with VR. Old TV sets, you would be able to watch a football game or soccer game very well on those. Now, when you've HD and you go back to your old TV, you go, that's rubbish. I wish I had the better one. So again, it's one of those things until you've seen it. So for me, the analogy is like watching sport on TV. It's the same type of thing. The better the resolution, yes, you pick up that detail more, but it still means you can still appreciate it. You can still do the things you need to do with the technology.
Yeah, and Dr. Levy, to your point, VR, people have tried to mimic or tried to capture the hitter-pitcher matchup. When we've tested it and taken it to upper-level players, the feedback is always, I don't see the seams on the ball. And for them, it's not been a realistic experience. So you're right. I mean, it's got to be hyper-realistic and it's got to be exacting, because that's how hitters make swing decisions, is they see the flight of the ball, yes, but also the spin of the ball. The earlier they're able to pick that up, the earlier they're able to make positive swing decisions.
Can I just make a comment on this? I guess we talk about the resolution. You're talking about the sharpness of the image. I guess there's evidence also to show that that's, you know, in several studies that have been done, that the sharpness of vision is not necessarily needed for discriminating between expert performance and lesser skill performance. So as an anecdotal example, you think of Steph Curry, who was MVP and then got contact lenses later on to correct his vision, but could perform at the high level, making decisions with an apparently blurrier environment. And the premise of the point light display is that it captures the representative movement pattern without the contours, the colors, and the sharp image. So those are the key discriminators of expert performance. And as a result, that information is used to then train the pickup of that information in a non-high resolution environment to make that anticipatory decision.
Yeah, Sean, that's a very good point, because we did something very similar with handball players. So again, it's an example where you have very little time to make that decision, and advanced cues, kinematic information from the movement of the body is what the information you have to tune into. And we did a study where we had avatars. So it was motion capture, and they were very high level avatars. We then did like a stick figure, and we did point lights. And they were equally as good with the point light as they were with the others. And you're right. In fact, there was less distraction, because it's about the patterning of information. It's the spatial temporal dynamics of that movement that's really, really important. And I think you're 100% right. It's something we can't ever forget in all of this.
But isn't the critical task in basketball, for example, very different than the critical task in hitting a thrown pitch baseball? It just seems that in terms of need, it's a very different action.
So I guess the point is that whether you're predicting an opponent, you're reading the kinematics locally of a single opponent. But in basketball, you're reading the pattern to predict where the pattern is going to the next opponent, to then predict what they will do. So you're always anticipating about the relationships from not necessarily what the contours and shapes of that, but the kinematic pattern of the interaction, and then the localized opponent, your direct opponent that has the ball, who might drive to the basket.
But that's exactly the beauty of understanding the different sports, because hitting a baseball that's pitched is very different than that, right? Whereas, team sports, whether basketball or soccer or American football, that's a certain prediction ability, certain reading the play, being able to anticipate what's going to happen, clearly critically important. Hitting a baseball, it can be two people on the field. No one else has to be on the field, and you'll have the same task to read the baseball, the arm slot, the arm movement, the finger position on the ball, the spin of the ball, and you have to do all that within a couple hundred milliseconds.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is it's still pattern recognition, whether you're reading four players in a synchrony or the one player's localized pattern of movements. It relates to the kinematics and interaction at a low level visual processing, more from peripheral vision, that's going to be faster. And that's, I think, what are the discriminators that we can tap into.
Yeah, and there are other cues, but I think that the higher you get in baseball, they talk about pitch tunneling, and it gets to where a pitcher can throw the exact same, everything looks exactly the same, and the only way to discriminate is kind of the seam to the wall of how it comes out. So yeah, I think just kind of get your bigger point, Dr. Labby. Like, I think there's huge differences between the sports and the fineness of resolution you might need when it gets to VR then.
Yeah, I think that's the difference I'm trying to highlight. Clearly, I think that you're right. I believe, Sean, you're right, and Kathy, that the bottom line perceptual requirements are very similar in terms of what you have to do. The data coming in is very different, and there's a different acuity requirement depending on the sport as well.
I wouldn't say the data is any different. I'd say the data is actually very similar. I mean, cricket's very similar to baseball as well. And people actually say, oh, I can see the fingers. They can't see the fingers on the ball. They aren't seeing that. It's back to that point, what do you really see? And it's not a thing that you're very conscious of these things. It's such an unconscious act that you're actually doing. And it comes back to the patterning of information, the temporal framework within what's happening, the looming, all of those different things as well, and the experience you've had and be able to deal with those. So I really think it's important to bear that in mind. There's a lot of research out there to show that. And another thing I would say is, right, okay, that's visual information. This is all about vision. But what about goal ball? What about people who are visually impaired? We've done lots of work on that. We've done lots of work on sonification, and the patterning of information is very similar as well. We did some interesting work in basketball, actually, where we've done some deceptive movement studies in rugby. So again, what's the information that signals deception? So we talk about balls and maybe spin deceives an opponent, but it's really interesting if you think about a sidestep, because you're actually using your own body to signal deception, and the way you control your body signals deception. So I had a student from Italy who came to do a study, and he basically had the question, what happens in basketball? So when you go to do a feint there and you're trying to perceive, and there's so much sound, you've got the bouncing of the ball, the rhythmicity of that, but you've also got the squeaks of the shoes on the floor that are telling you something. This was sound only. And the interesting thing, Sean, was when it was perception only, so we asked them just to put a slider along a thing. So you just had to go right or left, just like that. There, we didn't find much difference between our experts and novices. But we took them to the lab, we put them in forced platforms, they were standing like this, they just could hear somebody coming towards them, and they had to move left or right. There we find the expertise, when you coupled the perception to the action. So for me, it was fascinating that, yes, we talk a lot about vision, but we forget about the other senses, particularly things like sound and the additional information we get there too.
So Kathy, on that, in my perception test, I've always found quite good differences. If you take the international cricket batsmen, which I work with in the best Australian teams, I could plot their data point that's significantly, above guessing on a pure perception test where you're not moving, where there's no overt action coupling, which I would call a slightly different, I would define that in a different way, to someone who's a club level player to a novice. And you can see from the guessing line where it is. So yeah, there's some interesting parts in the data, I guess, stories in the data.
Well, yeah. A great story is the Ronaldo video on Sky Sports, where he has a ball and they have eye trackers against a less skilled player, we'll say, the host, and one tries to take it away from the other, and Ronaldo, what he picks up in terms of cues to what the other guy's going to do, he's about 3 steps ahead of the other guy, and the other guy is watching him and tries to take the ball from him, and he's literally 3 steps behind. Where he puts his foot, that's where Ronaldo was, a couple seconds ago. And so clearly there's a skill there in perception of what is seeing and being able to predict where the foot and the ball and the hips are going to go in the future. And that's the key to success, I think.
Yeah, in that example, though, the person who was against it was a TV presenter and he wasn't an expert. It was for television. But you're right, there's a good point there. So, yeah. And Sean, back to your point about the perception and the perception coupled to action, because I think it really is interesting and it's helped separate out that detecting information and the action capabilities. So when we did the sidestep, we used temporal occlusion like you did. We looked at the ability to perceive and anticipate. we found some very interesting results. A scrum half from New Zealand was our best player in both perception and perception coupled to action. But our second best player in perception only was a second row player, a big guy, very experienced. But when it came to coupling perception and action, he was less good at being able to make that tackle and get into the right place. And it's to do with his action capabilities, his body inertia. He started moving in the wrong direction and he couldn't then correct for it. Whereas scrum halves, who tended to be smaller, had that lower center of mass and were able to adapt. So I think there's fascinating work to be done there. And then helping you to understand your players. Is it a perceptual deficit? Is it a skill deficit? That's what's really interesting.
These panels are always best when I talk the least as possible, and it's probably been about 10 minutes since I've gotten a word in here. But I did want to bring up one thing that Dr. Labby and I have talked about a few times in the past. He wrote an essay a few years ago, The Visual Case Against Batting Practice. And anyone who's been around baseball knows for 100 years, the guy, the batting practice pitcher, gets out there and throws it. I've been in ballparks where the radar gun's on, and it's remarkably like 52, 53 miles an hour, almost every single pitch. And that has absolutely nothing to do with the actual sport of baseball. So what is, I'd love to, for our audience here, I'd love to hear you make a quick summary of your case against batting practice. And then, teams have finally in the last 2-3 years really started to change that practice up. What is that way of, linking, perception with the motor skill and anticipation, particularly like right before a competition?
I'll give you a quick 1-2 minute summary of that point. The idea being, barring the other motor aspects of batting practice, which I'm not going to get into, but in terms of visual cognitive processing, learning, trying to employ neuroplasticity to be a better batter. To me, batting practice where you have somebody a short distance from you that's lobbing the balls in, as you say, at about 50 miles an hour, and you're just hitting balls over the fence, which is nothing like what's happening when the pitcher is 60 feet, 6 inches away at 100 miles an hour. The timing is much less. The ball moves. There's spin. There's different perceptual clues completely to pick up and to time and to anticipate, predict where the ball's going to go. To me, you're teaching somebody to do something that is not the same and is actually the opposite of what they have to do when they're actually batting. And other sports like cricket, for example, bring in pitchers that want to try to make the team to throw batting practice. There are professional teams that are doing something similar to that because they're understanding that the batters will benefit the most if they're facing closer to real major league pitchers as opposed to someone just lobbing a ball in. And to me, there may be some role for batting practice in the future, but it's certainly not as relevant as it has been for the last 100+ years.
Yeah, I'd echo that point. I think I brought it up earlier, if I didn't cut out at that point, that I think we've trained hitters wrong to some extent, that it needs to be more about timing. It needs to be more about the patterning, the cues, to be able to pick up what pitch is coming. And you've even seen a few high-profile instances of Bryce Harper stopped taking batting practice on the field. He didn't think it was helpful. Evan Longoria has done the same. Joe Madden famously doesn't let guys hit on the field at times because they get out of their swing because they're just trying to hit home runs and they're not working on the things they need to be working on. So I think there's a lot of validity to that. I think we're going to look back in 50 years from now, and I think we're probably going to train hitters a little bit differently. Unfortunately, in baseball, and those of us that have been a part of that, a lot of times we do things in baseball because it's always been done that way. And I think batting practice is, right now, it's one of those things. I think it's a sacred cow that we've started to chip away at a little bit more, and I think we will continue to do so. But yeah, I would absolutely agree that, again, hitters are retired at the top level because their timing is disrupted, not because of, a swing, necessarily a mechanical flaw. So why aren't we training that, first and foremost when we're training hitters, especially at the top level?
Mm-hmm. A question I want to get to from the audience, it's a good question, and I say that not just because he's my editor. Is there an age or range of ages where athletes start to naturally develop the specialized kind of vision they need to excel in their chosen sports? Is there a way to find out if all-around athletic kids should pursue one sport over another because of their visual fingerprint? Anyone want to take a stab?
Well, we've looked at that, quite a bit. As a pediatric ophthalmologist, I have many kids that I see that are aspiring athletes in different sports. And as I mentioned, different sports have different visual need patterns, we'll say. So I think there is a visual fingerprint. That's a good way of terming it for each sport. it doesn't mean it's absolute. We see many athletes that are good at one sport, Michael Jordan, that tries to go to a different sport and may not be as successful. You know, your athleticism will take you so far, but you do need certain skills, whether they're perceptual skills or purely visual skills or not, in order to succeed in a different sport. Very few people, I think, have been able to be elite in more than one sport.
Mm-hmm. And so is there a time where that winnowing or filtering happens?
Well, I think it happens naturally. I think, you know, as a high schooler might play several sports during, you know, different seasons of high school. As they move on, they're going to pick the sport that they're doing best in, and that's where they're going to go. So I think it becomes more natural. It could be more useful if it's guided visually to some extent, where with some evaluative process that can help educate a prospective player where they may have their most strengths. They put their money or their time and their energy into that earlier, but I don't think that really happens too much at this point.
Yeah, I'd also hate to give kids one more reason to specialize. Like, I think we're getting enough of that. And we see, at least in the skills we're testing, we see them being malleable. You know, they're not necessarily set. You'd have to speak to some more of our techs to find out how much some of these things can improve, and maybe Dr. Lavie can speak to that a little bit more. But again, I encourage kids to develop a broad range of skills on the field and discourage them from specializing too soon, and know that, you know, a lot of these things are malleable, can be improved when they practice.
Yeah, so from my point of view, I mean, I would agree. I would be against early specialization. I think, like, you know, colleagues like Damien Farrow talked a lot about backyard sports and how kids nowadays don't get that opportunity to practice in these unpredictable environments where the ball bounces a little bit strange, where they're doing something different and stuff like that. We need to preserve that. But what we're trying to do in Incisive is really trying to build out this concept of action intelligence, where it's really that ability to make the right decision at the right time, execute it in the right way, that comes together. And I think there is a type of intelligence that we do have in sport. It's a matter of operationalizing that and measuring it in some specific way. We've got 5 pillars of action intelligence. So there's force control, which would be things like golf. You've got rhythmic coordination, which would probably be things more like dance. You've got interception. You've got fine motor control as well. And of course, you've got balance, which is the foundation to all of those. So I think, again, looking at the motor skills, looking at the motor adaptation, looking at the ability to couple perception and action and all of those, I think that's where we need to look at. And then we'll try and adapt people who have got the, I suppose, aptitude for one of those. So I think it's an exciting area to look at.
Great. I see a bit of chat. Oh, Sean, did you have something to add?
Yeah, Joe, I think for me, I think in terms of specialisation and generalisation, I think really a little bit more work needs to be done in the literature to say one or the other. Because if you talk about generalising, you're talking about transfer of skill. And I'm not sure that there's enough literature to say that it transfers broadly across a variety of sports that are either intermediate or far from the chosen sport yet. So for me, it's, you know, yes, specialisation has its negative psychosocial aspects, but if a kid's having fun and they're enjoying it, I'm not sure that I'm going to be pulling them out of it. At the same time, I'm not discouraging them from trying other sports as well. But as to whether that helps expertise is really a transfer argument. I'm not sure there's enough evidence to say that's transfer happening, to say now diversify yet. So I think there's a bit of work that needs to be done in that area first.
Mm-hmm. See a bit of chatter on the board about golf. Has anyone done some work into golf and what visual skills are helpful there?
I've done work on golf, but more putting and more around timing, more the temporal control of action again. So not really so much on the vision, because strictly speaking, we've looked at how we can try and develop some temporal guides to help with the force control. So if you think about, I draw a distinction between interceptive action and things like golf putting, which is an intrinsic temporally controlled action. So when you're hitting the ball in baseball, if you don't tune into and use the temporal information of the ball coming towards you, you're not going to succeed. The difference with golf, the difference with, say, taking a kick in rugby, a penalty kick, is the ball isn't moving. So there's no temporal information externally available for you to pick up through your senses to help you guide your action. That all has to come from in here. And that's why it can go so horribly wrong, is because the temporal control of action is still critically important to task success, but it's intrinsically generated. And I think we did quite a bit of work looking at externalizing that, again, using sounds and things like that, and light displays. So we did try to use visual little light displays to try and externalize the pattern of movement you should make to hit the ball a certain distance, but it wasn't as effective as the sound was, because we're very good at carrying sounds around in our head, and then we can use those and call them up, just like a tune. So again, it's trying to use something that can help you control. But in terms of vision there, it's not probably the same type of thing as baseball, for example.
I think one of the things that first got me to use the Tobii glasses and to look into eye fixation is Jones Vicker's work and others following her in terms of the quiet eye and what the fixation is prior to, during, and after the critical action of putting, for example, or swinging a golf club. To me, that's probably the highest value piece of information I can give somebody, a golfer, to improve their game, is evaluating and studying their fixation pattern during that task. You don't need 20/15 vision to hit a golf ball, but you do need to have the quiet eye to be successful.
Mm-hmm. We have I know we're right around the hour mark. Thankfully, it's not a hard deadline, but we will wrap up shortly. But did want to get to one more question, especially since I know it's someone that our panelists know. From Vishnu asks, Kathy and Sean, is VR and temporal occlusion primarily used for research and skill acquisition purposes, or can it be modified specifically toward game prep and scouting purposes?
I have tended to use the occlusion for research purposes. So really for me there, it was trying to understand. So the temporal occlusion, you use it to try and understand what is the information somebody's using, because you control how much information they see. When you allow the whole event to occur, then they've got the whole informational flow field. So you're not quite sure what is the information they're using. So for me, it's more of a research purpose. For scouting, it's a very good question, because that's something we do in Clean Sheet. So that's our goalkeeping product that we've got for soccer, but we're also doing something, Sean, interestingly, for field hockey. So again, there it's decision making, right place, right time, ability to pick up ball flight, advanced information from the kinematics of, say, the kicker or the striker. The interesting thing about VR technology and where it can be used in talent ID is you can give everybody exactly the same input. So even though you're the best soccer player in the world, they couldn't give you exactly the same kick each time. It would have a different velocity, a different ball flight, end up in a different place, etc., etc., etc. The nice thing about VR technology is you have reproducibility across trials. So for anybody who's a psychologist knows that you need to be able to do that to get a real reliable measure of performance. So again, for me, VR technology, what's it great for? Controlling input to the brain and measuring output from the brain. And I think what never ceases to amaze me is I can give 5 players exactly the same input and they all respond very differently with varying degrees of success. And I know that's what Premiership teams are really interested in. They're maybe buying soccer goalkeepers and they don't really know how good they are. That was a question I got asked last year. I've bought a £10 million goalkeeper and I don't know how good he is. So they've seen some video clips, but again, you can test them. And the interesting thing about our use of technology with the coaches here is that you identify weaknesses. So I can give exactly the same shots on the left hand and the right hand side. I can mirror the shots so they're identical. I can see biases in response. So one of my players from Canada, actually, he had saved more balls with his left hand than his right hand, but yet they were evenly distributed, so there was no reason for that. So again, you can start to analyze technique. It's back to that action capability that might be influencing the decision. That's where I see the technology really coming into its own.
Vishnu, good question. So I think the work being done in the 2D occlusion and point light is applied research that then is evidence-based practice for application. So you can use it to talent identify, you can use it for pre and post baseline tests, track them, and use it to train. So I guess that research provides its application and how it can be then applied and used. So I would personally be moving more towards the point light display as those 2 methods, because it becomes a more fine discriminator, and then it can also be used to train, and that's what I've done in my work.
Mm-hmm. Great. We probably should wind down. So for those of you in the audience who didn't get your question answered or haven't had a chance to ask it, if you email stlive@sporttechie.com, we can try to pass it along to the panelists, and perhaps we'll be able to answer it after the fact. But now I'd love to, we've covered a lot of great ground. Didn't get to everything I expected to, which is a good thing, a good problem to have. And so I'd love to give each of the panelists just, maybe a minute or two for a final word. Any other points that you didn't get to, or perhaps a view toward the future. Kathy, we'll let you play lead off here.
Okay, yeah, no, thanks a million for having me. It's been great fun and a fantastic discussion. I think it's very exciting. I think we're on the cusp of something really interesting. I think it's also back to the data point. It's back to what can we measure with the technology that we couldn't maybe measure before, and how can that allow us to improve performance and allow everybody to be the best they can be. We just had a conversation with Franz Hoek, who would have coached goalkeepers at Barcelona and Manchester United. And where I see it being exciting, so you imagine the VR technology, where that technology is going is you and I could share the same space, Joe. So I could be in a goalkeeper position. You could be watching me on the virtual pitch together, even though you're in New York and I'm here in Belfast. You could watch my technique and you could be able to coach me. Or alternatively, I can have a go and then you can have a go. So, esports, everybody's talking about esports. I do struggle with esports. I do struggle with the fact you're always at a keyboard. Your movements are very minimal. I much prefer things where the movements are natural and more sport-like. You could imagine competitions in the future where free kicks are being generated by a computer and you're able to see who is the best person in the whole world at doing this. Kids doing that in stadia, same with baseball, same with all of these sports. Yes, there'll always be a slight limitation in what you're doing, but you're still testing those perceptual cognitive skills to get to the right place at the right time. I'd love to see that.
That sounds great. Lucas?
Yeah, I'd very much echo Kathy that this is exciting. For me, it's the next frontier of player development, especially as it applies to baseball. It's starting to use tech both to track and improve sports vision. Whether it's foundationally through a program like Visual Edge that applies across a wide swath of sports, and then getting into more specifics with sports tech and things like VR and being able to train hitters that way. So for me, this is the next tier. If as I mentioned earlier, if hitters are going to catch up to pitchers, they're going to have to start training their brains, training their eyes to be able to pick up on cues faster, to be able to react to faster projectiles thrown at them, because it's not going back to what it once was before. That's for sure.
Sean?
Joe, thanks very much, and to all the other panelists and for everyone listening in today. I think the future really in terms of application, Joe, for me is for teams and athletes to think about the product that they're investing in. Has there evidence behind it? Is it a discriminator? Does it predict? Can it be used to train? What evidence is there before they just pick it up off the shelf and use it? Because you could be just training a placebo effect. That's the other thing that you have to be careful about. The non-discriminators, the things that are just make you feel good, and that's not actually related to performance. So I think we need to move forward. And there's a variety of things discussed here. I think the consumer needs to think, what are those key products and what's the evidence behind it? If not, talk to the people that know about it before you invest in it, so you can properly design perceptual, motor, cognitive training programs.
Great. Dr. Labby, bring us home.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everybody. And I'll just pick up on Sean's words. For the general public, you don't want to have a closet like I have full of old thrown away devices that haven't stood up to the test of statistics and haven't shown any value. I waste my money. You don't have to waste your money on that. That's my job to do that. I want to end on a positive note. I think this year, the COVID year has been a disaster for everybody, but I think in some regards, I think we've seen with vaccine development, it's really spurned the ability to create vaccines quickly and test them that we haven't had before. And I think in sports, it's done the same thing. I think in sports vision, we've seen devices, techniques that are coming out of this remote testing, just like Kathy described with you, Joe, that you could be in two different cities and interact together to do training and to do evaluation together. We just came back from working with some of the teams in spring training where we sat in the hotel room and we did virtual testing from a hotel room to the team's locker room or the clubhouse where we weren't allowed to go in. And whether it was hands-on with the team there doing the actual kind of our hands for us, or whether it's purely remote where the player logs into an online system that does what we used to do in person. I think that all developed out of COVID this past year to allow us to continue to evaluate players, help players optimize their visual function and perform at their best natural talent. And so, a positive note out of this terrible year, I think, is that progress, that technology has really gotten pushed, and that's a good thing.
That's great. Well, thank you all very much. As I said, from all three continents that we have here. And I would be remiss if I didn't plug to the audience that our flagship annual event, State of the Industry, is coming up in 2 weeks' time. It's completely free. Go to events.sporttechie.com to register, and you won't be disappointed. Thanks again, everybody, especially to our panelists. Virtual round of applause.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.